Let's talk VDML with KJR.
Well, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk VDML, which is really a podcast series about practical approaches to AI assurance. And I'm really delighted to have, my name's Mike Pedersen, by the way, if you haven't seen me on this podcast before, but I'm delighted to have with me Sean Johnson and James Gowsey, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Sean, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Mark. Sean Johnson. I'm the Managing Director of a company called Lakefield Drive, and we do governance advisory work. And obviously in the governance space, AI is now firmly embedded as one of the key areas that boards of directors and governance professionals need to take into account. So my work is primarily with not-for-profit organisations, but work across the spectrum.
Yeah, and you're being a literal digital nomad at the moment because you're calling from somewhere in central Queensland on the go. I've caught you somewhat on a holiday, but you're...
Well, it's not a holiday. We decided that we would try working from the van on the road and see how much we could cope with this as a digital nomad.
Yeah.
And it's been fantastic. In fact, I've had to lock myself inside because the bird noises are so loud at the moment.
There you go. Well, I'm very glad you could join us. James.
I'm James Gowsey. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Ethē. Ethē produces a platform that helps organisations adopt the Australian and international standard for AI management systems, 42001. We've been progressively building out our platform over the last 9 months since it was announced as the Australian standard. And our goal is to help people go from zero to effectively compliant within the space of ideally days rather than months. It's something that we've got a bit of experience in other areas, and we're really excited to use those skills in this area as well. It's a passion of ours.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think that there's been a lot happening in this space, so I was excited that both of you are available to have this conversation. We all met earlier this year at the Tropical Innovation Festival, where there was again a really strong theme around AI, and we really hit it off. I learned a lot from both of you, and I think this space has just continued to become more interesting. I was in Canberra just the day before yesterday, also having a lot of conversations with people there. So at that sort of federal level in Australia, now we've got people being sort of like tapped on the shoulder to say, you are now the responsible officer for AI within this government department, and by February next year you've got to produce a transparency statement that says what AI you're using and how you're governing it and so forth.
Easy.
And it seems sort of innocuous. And I think some folks are attempting to go down the path of, if we have any AI, we're going to turn it off before February so we can our transparency statement says we don't have any. But I think even that is definitely proving much harder than what it seems at first. And hopefully there's people who are actually embracing the possibilities. I'm certainly an AI optimist. This is not about running away from the benefits, but it's really about how do we make use of these things and do it well. With that kind of policy happening at the federal level, and then also just recently Queensland government coming out with their own sort of assurance and governance policy that's saying, here's a risk assessment process that we want you to use. Here's a governance process that we want you to use. Are you seeing like an uptick in interest in the sorts of things? Are you seeing questions bubbling up at that board level or at that sort of maybe more the implementer management level? What's sort of happening for you guys?
Well, I can tell you that there's probably more confusion than clarity around what's required, and it looks like everybody's having a go at putting a document in the marketplace to provide guidance, ranging from mandatory regulatory approach through to voluntary regulatory approaches. And I've got some concerns as to whether people actually fully understand it. I mean, your comment earlier about turning it off is actually more prevalent than is reasonable, to be frank. People are starting to say, well, we just don't want it in the place if we've got all this regulatory compliance on top. And it does become a very confused landscape for what should be done. And then obviously we get into the governance piece of, well, how do you monitor? How do you, authenticate all of the back end part? So at the moment, there's a lot of people, I think, looking from the outside without launching in.
Yeah, which I think is really reflected in the national sort of responsible AI index report that was just recently been published by the National AI Centre, and that was sort of the strong theme or the strong finding of that report. It was like, oh, there's people who are interested and they're looking, but they're not implementing. And as they phrased it in a presentation just the other day, there's a big say do gap. It's like people are saying, oh yeah, we're interested in this, but then where do I start?
Yeah, we were talking about that just before we had this this recorded session, Mark, where what we're finding is that there is a level of and justified fear at the board level about the liabilities and their accountability in the scenario, and they don't want to introduce undue risks to their people or to their customers and so on. And conversely, everybody's talking about the benefits of AI, and I think there is a healthy appetite for the benefits, but at the moment, the perceived risks outweigh the benefits. And I say perceived because what we're seeing in all of these many and varied documents that are coming out at the federal and state level is that they're actually pretty well mapped together. And they have been put together in a really cohesive way. Something I find myself saying is I've been very pleasantly surprised with the rate at which this work has occurred and how coordinated it has been, not just with governments in Australia, but internationally as well. And in Australia, we have this great kind of legacy of adopting a set of AI ethics principles back in 2019, which were then mapped into the public sector's approach, which were then mapped into what we're now seeing as the voluntary safety standard, and ultimately into those mandatory AI guardrails. And so I think there is a bit of, there's a jarring effect that we've got a bit of whiplash about the extent and power and complexity of these systems. But we do have the ability to stand on the shoulders of giants. It's just knowing where to look and trying to find the signal in the noise, if that makes sense, because the frameworks that are coming out, at least domestically, are pretty clear. There are pretty clear straight lines drawn between them, which is really encouraging.
Yeah, and I've been finding that myself in the workshops. I was running a range of workshops over the last few weeks around AI governance and also around testing large language models, and pointing people to the voluntary standard and then the proposed sort of mandatory guardrails for high risk, and going, look, these are the same things that are being asked for, and it's consistent with the ethics framework, and it's consistent with what's been talked about more internationally. And in some respects, it's there's lots of detail and there's lots of work that needs to be done, but it's not necessarily all that different to what we are already doing with things like IT and information systems. I think probably the challenge is that we go, oh, it's another thing. We're already feeling stressed about not getting caught up in a privacy breach, and now there's another technology, and we've got to do some more monitoring around that sort of stuff. Is that the sort of thing that you're seeing, Sean, where people are just going, I'm already at my limit as an organization, don't give me
I'm
another.
definitely seeing that. I mean, I'm dealing with organisations that are still wrestling with cybersecurity
Yes.
and how it works. You know, it's okay for people on the inside of the tech industry who have understood that these things have been evolving for a fair amount of time, but there's a lot of organisations that, you know, their engagement with tech is nothing more than using it as a tool, like, you know, the Microsoft suite or whatever they might be, various software platforms. But I get concerned about whether the reach, particularly with the mandatory guidelines in the high-risk sector. So a lot of my clients are in the health sector, and they're allied health. They're not in the mainstream part, but their members are, you know, giving advice and various things. So I've been trying to explore some scenarios of, well, what if you developed and used AI to develop a menu design strategy for a dietitian, for example?
Yes.
Where would the obligations fall? And they're quite heavy in terms of what's required. Now, you know, there's some technicalities in there that I've been reflecting on, and I often describe AI, particularly the user end of simple AI, like ChatGPT, and to use the word simple, that's a complete overreach of the use of the word, but it's easily accessible for those of us that are not tech heads. And that's where a lot of people can play with those tools, and they can use it to, say, build a policy. You explore that out further and say, well, if I used an intern in my office to write that policy without ChatGPT, would I have to meet all the requirements that I have to meet under the guardrails? The answer is no. But if I use AI to write it, then I have a whole series of obligations that I may have to comply with. And we get into these interesting overlaps. Well, what's wrong with the current legal system at the moment for dealing with those types of things? Why are we laying another one over the top of that? And I think, you know, I've got to say, I'm not fussed on a 1 month period for consultation on the mandatory one because of the sheer implications that are sitting inside that. It's normally a 2 month turnaround for many of my clients in the boardroom. So to get a policy position to reflect upon this and feed it back and say, what's the implication for our members? You know, I think it's got all the hallmarks of regulatory overreach and rushing. And I don't mind that it's well sewn together, but I'm not sure how far we understand the reach of this, particularly in the innovation space. It would seem to be now, unless you are really cashed up, playing in the innovation using AI is only going to be for those people and not for the small firms.
I might challenge that perspective a little bit, because my experience of it is that it has been a pretty extensive consultation process. This process kicked off about over a year ago now, about 15 months ago now, where the program was announced, and then there was an initial consultation. There was an interim response which came out around January. And then there was consultation with industry and academia. They set up an expert group panel of industry and academics. They engaged with the Human Technology Institute at University of Technology Sydney, who ended up writing the standard in consultation with Department of Industry. I think there is a justified, like you're rightly referring to the level of overwhelm in the boardroom and the level of overwhelm at the executive level. But I think it would be fair to say that governments, and not just the Australian government, but governments around the world, are concerned for the safety of their people, hence the perceived rush, if that makes sense. Which is kind of funny, because when government moves slow, we're upset, and when government moves fast, we're upset, and we're just generally upset with government and industry a little bit. But at the end of the day, just to kind of draw the curtain a little bit, there are a lot of really well-informed people who've been consulted on this, and I'm really confident that can be used proportionally. It doesn't have to be a big textbook that gets thrown at people. And it is consistent with Australian human rights law, what's been proposed. And there isn't much else. There are all of the existing human rights orientated acts that have been called out in the proposed principles. Yeah, I do think it's going to be pretty nicely compatible. And so to hear that is the perception out there in a lot of organizations, that might speak to a little bit that NAIC report that you mentioned, Mark, where there is a gap between what we want to do, what we say we want to do, and then actually getting out and doing it. And there's a knowledge gap there, which is causing that tension perhaps. But yeah, interested to hear what you guys think.
I mean, I guess one quick comment is that I think what I'm seeing that sort of bridges both of those worlds, because I think, James, it's probably fair to say that you're sitting a little bit more inside the tent there, talking to, and part of that consultation process.
I'd say I'm at the campfire between all the tents. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But you've got some insight into the process, and you've been engaged, actively. And if people are sitting, haven't been actively engaged, then it's suddenly popping up on their radar, and that is overwhelming. But one of the things I'm noticing is that even within the standards and regulatory environment, the pace of change at the technology level is almost overwhelming the normal regulatory pace of things. So I've been working, helping to formulate more of the updated AI testing standard, but there's some real time pressure around getting that updated, because there's legislation that's due to start applying that says things like thou shalt test if you're in high risk. But then, of course, the legislation doesn't say exactly how. So there's an expectation that there needs to be something that you can point to that says this is what we expect to see. So, yeah, there's some real pressure to do a lot of these things and deal with the technology and the risks quickly, because they're manifesting daily. We're seeing people get caught up in misuse of ChatGPT. There was stuff in the headlines yesterday in Victoria. And so people are, if we don't step in and say something about this is how things should be done, harm will occur, and it's already occurring. So,
what level of culpability? The party that we haven't talked about yet is the vendors, and how much accountability should we place at their feet for rushing the market, and what effective controls could we have at the societal level? Possibly, it'd probably have to be at the societal level, right? To say, because the pause paper was a bit of a laughing stock in the tech sector at the very least, despite the fact that many notable and smart and genuinely caring people were signatories to it. It really makes me wonder, are we as a society getting caught up in this rush? Like and is there an opportunity to change that? If not, then yeah, we've probably just got to get all our things in a pile, so to speak. But yeah,
I agree with you. It's got all the hallmarks of panic. And that's not a great policy place to be in a heavily and quickly evolving tech space as well. As Mark raised, it's I've got to say congratulations to everybody who's had a go at trying to sort this out, and no one will be happy with the end result. But I suppose, from a personal perspective, perhaps, I get concerned about the fact that there's so little we don't know yet about the implications of what it is we're trying to do. And back at my client level, what we're going to end up doing is pushing stuff underground. And
Mm.
And it'll be beyond the sight of those who are responsible, the authorised officer and various people, where this stuff goes underground, and both good and bad goes underground. So you get the potential for people dumping private data into El Cheapo versions of AI software without buying the right proper license, because if they did that, they'd have to tell someone. But you also push your innovation underground, and so that the great things they're doing become hidden. The implications on the vendor side, James, that you raised, I mean, I just sat down and was scratching my head this morning and said, explore the issue of something as simple as a statistical model, like using Monte Carlo simulation in a risk analysis. At what point does that become defined as AI or not AI? What happens in the risk management software that's produced that does your risk modelling? How far back is the obligation? And does this mean under, because as a deployer, the vendor of the risk software would have to say, here's where we've used AI, if we've used AI somewhere in the system. And then and so the costs of that software are just going to go boom. So there's a massive supply chain cost that gets added to this once we all get into the fine detail of how much is enough in terms of disclosure. So I'm not sure when we really get into the cost benefit analysis that we've thought about that. Now, I'm not for a moment saying we should just let everybody go rife and do whatever they like. Of course, I'm not saying that. But there are other models than a government-imposed legislative framework. The trouble is they take more thinking.
Yeah. I think you really raised some really interesting examples. So, your individual allied health, practice might be one person, could be 5 people, but, they use a large language model to help them compile reports or do things like that. There can and should be a duty of care around how you deal with any sensitive information. And, part of the interesting ways, if you look at the legislation, you run a childcare centre or something like that, and you've probably got all of the parents, payment details or whatever. They fill in a form and someone photocopies it and files it, etc. But your turnover sits underneath the threshold to have the Privacy Act apply. So there are some of those sorts of limitations that might kick in for SMEs, where you go, well, your obligations are less because the overall risk that to the population is less. But if you're Optus or Telstra or whatever, then 100% you should be being very careful and protecting people's private information, because the cost to the economy as a whole, if there's a privacy breach, is significant. And there's sort of similar issues, I guess, with historical versus new uses. Like, does this regulation catch up with things like flood simulation monitoring? And then, if we get it wrong because actually our AI models don't work as well as they used to because of climate change, so when we predict where the patterns, they might be actually turn out to be really off, and then there's a massive flood and lots of homes are lost or whatever, who's responsible? And as you say, do you end up with some sort of blown out cost because of insurance or things like that?
Look, I think
absolutely the chain of responsibility issue. Sorry, James.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. You go first.
Well, the chain of responsibility problem will be amazing. As a lawyer watching, who would you name in a claim if you're acting for a plaintiff in a personal injury? I mean, the list becomes endless, and this opens up a Pandora's box of who you can sheet that home to. And I've got quite a lot of clients in the north of the country where climate change, as we now call it, environmental risk from cyclones and floods and various disasters, it's already wreaking havoc on the insurance premiums of the client. So this is just another one that is there to be had, and it'll really put the owners back into the boardroom, all the way back to your first statement of, can we afford to do this? Can we afford to use this new tech?
Can I pick up on that kind of chain of responsibility or chain of accountability idea? Because I don't think the intention of these proposed guardrails, which are currently voluntary and will be made mandatory for using categorization, which is as yet undefined, but we know to be human rights focused. The target is certainly not a small allied health provider, you know, and I think that this is the opportunity for innovation here, because if we can say to the small allied health provider, for example, hey, here's the ACSC small business cybersecurity checklist equivalent that you can perform. That's just a checklist that you can perform every time you adopt a new software, and it might include something like, is this going to make recommendations to your health sector customers? Yes, no. If yes, do they have ISO 42001 compliance? Yes, no. And then you're getting a bit of it's not a high definition risk assessment, but it is a fuzzy, proportional, high level risk assessment of any tool that you adopt. And I think that that's really what we're trying to do. We're not trying to get the mum and dad operations to run 42001 or know the ins and outs of a mandatory AI guardrails. But we are asking that people hold this, especially the developers, to account on the design and implementation and responsible implementation of these systems. So I think that chain is what we're hoping to construct as a society, and that the appropriately resourced organizations to look after that, the accountability should flow to them, or at least that's what I hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that sort of tension around, you know, the process versus product risk. And I think the concept of going, well, if you're the vendor, if you're making the brake parts or you're making the car, you're responsible for actually making those parts or the whole thing work well and to be reliable to a certain standard. And we'll go and build detailed industry standards that will say exactly how you test the brake parts.
This is one of the unique value propositions of Australian industry as well. We've always been good at quality. We've always been good at safety. We've always been good at management systems, and we're known for it throughout the world. Look at the safety culture, multi-billion-dollar tech company, which was built off the back of quality checklists. You know, we're no strangers as a society to this. And I don't think this is going to be much different. It's just a different domain area with much more powerful, arguably, and at-scale technologies. And I think once we kind of work out where the handles are, define where the handles are, and start to use them, I think it'll be a little bit more simple than we might expect.
Yeah. So look, go for it, Sean.
Yeah, look, I was going to revert back to the risk-based element that they talk about within, particularly the mandatory framework, and the room for getting that right, moving into things like what's the terminology, responsive regulation, and moving down that risk, understanding what risk-based really means. Now, I've had the joy of working for a regulator before that was operating in a risk-based environment, and it was still a challenging concept to work through. Where do you draw those lines in these concepts? I don't disagree with James at all. Yes, we want the big end to take responsibility for what it is. But I always get nervous about the boundaries of where does that reach end, and where does the overcreep filter into the system. But it is possible to put in place a responsive regulatory model that is proportional, which is the intent of what is being talked about. And I think that's obviously a very positive, and it's in line with modern risk thinking at the regulatory level as well. I also think there's massive opportunities for this to drive collaborative behaviours in terms of pooling people and ideas and concepts and really starting to, if we can get beyond the fear of AI into back to the conversation about the potential of AI, and how it can massively escalate benefits in terms of simply just productivity alone. Australia's got a massive productivity problem. This is a key to doing it, but not unless we can unlock the economy to enable that to happen.
There was a conversation I was having with some procurement teams the other day, and they were expressing some of their fears around AI, and something that we kind of all locked eyes on, and we're like, yeah, actually, that makes sense. Risk, the word risk is the organizational manifestation of the word fear. And once we take it from a fear-based language to a risk-based language, it becomes a little bit more manageable. And then we were talking about the fact that, well, when risks get managed and we either accept those risks or we choose to mitigate for them or control for them, all of a sudden, that's kind of like an organizational version of mindfulness, like as a collective, we've just agreed that, we accept that, it's acceptance. But it taking it from fear to an articulation of risk to an articulation of controls, I think is the appropriate flow for that conversation. And I think we've seen the same thing happen in cybersecurity over the better part of a decade as well. So
So the challenge I've seen in the boardroom, just running with that, because I like that idea of reframing the narrative, reframing the language of what we're doing. But AI at the moment is a big noise, but boards are sitting down with their risk registers and working through in an order of priority. What are the priorities they're looking at? Now, for us three, we look at AI and tech and cyber and privacy, and we go, oh my God, you really need to get on top of this. In many boardrooms, that's not the major risk factor they're wrestling with. There are other things that are taking higher priority, which is pushing this down the priority list until, like many things, it just gets so big they've got to do something with it. So that's the other challenge is, I was talking to some colleagues I went out to dinner with last night, and none of them engage at any level with AI. Now, they're not in my profession. They're just a bunch of lovely people doing their jobs, but didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And that's, I think, permeates a lot of places. So no, we weren't involved in the conversation on this particular regulatory framework because that's just not our landscape. But they're going to be impacted by it. Sorry.
Yeah, right. So as we sort of, I think I said this before we kicked off, the three of us could probably talk for, 2 hours or something. But I guess to sort of like draw some of this conversation into something practical, whether people are sitting sort of like, oh, it's not really on my horizon, but then it'll, maybe loom up suddenly, versus, people who are embedded. But what's some of the practical things that, from your perspective, people could be doing to actually shift from fear to risk management and really ultimately benefits realization, like where I can get benefit? What are some of the practical things that?
Well, one of the end game of one of the things I'd like to do is actually get hold of James's software, and we've talked about this before. But to get to that, I've got to move my clients down that risk narrative pathway. And we've got to start by putting in place concepts that are more structured. Some of them have got very robust systems, and some of them have got just enough systems to get them through in there. But as we can build that into an embedded part of the culture of doing business, and that's why I thoroughly like that shift of narrative into mindfulness and things that might resonate with their language, then all of a sudden we can start to build that and embed that infrastructure that all of a sudden means, and then we can get a system that will help us structure this in a way that's consumable and has relatively low transaction cost levels while still being robust. So for me, it's culture shifting at the moment.
100%. From my perspective, I think The organizations that are going to succeed in adopting AI confidently over the next kind of 6 to 12 to 24 months and really realize the business value or the organizational value or the societal value or what have you are the ones that understand explicitly what their values are. They can manifest those values as objectives for their AI systems. They're going to measure their AI systems performance against those objectives, and they're going to do that continuously over time. That sounds big, but it doesn't have to be, and it really depends on the size of the use case that you're trying to address. I think one of the things that gets us all, causes us to hyperventilate, it does for me at the very least, is the general applicability of tools like ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, and how they're embedded in our tools now. And so because they're everywhere, they overwhelm, and we want to try and use them for everything because they are there. Like, we have this law of the instrument problem, which is fascinating. But what I encourage people to do is find one use case, find one minor use case, and then we'll build a set of proportional controls around that one minor use case, because you're not going to be better at this overnight. It's going to take practice. It's going to take a little bit of resources. It's going to take one pilot project, and then you're going to get rolling from there. You're going to build those capabilities, and it's not just going to be one team or one person. And I'm hugely in favor of a named role for accountability for AI in organizations. Get that person to lead that one use case project, develop a set of governance controls around it that are consistent with the draft regulation, and see how you go. And if you don't get the value, you've got your answer. Revisit in a year. If you do get the value, if you get 10x the value, you know that you're onto something, and you can go to the next item in the roadmap and be reasonably confident that you're going to get return on investment.
Look, I think getting hands-on, I think, Sean, you were saying this earlier this year at TIFF, the sandpit. Every organization needs that, sort of sandpit to do a bit of exploration in. Don't try and boil the ocean, but to just get in, build some capability, get familiar, understand what use cases actually deliver value and which ones don't deliver value. I think one of the things I took a lot of encouragement from reading the Queensland Government sort of foundational AI risk assessment tool is that at the back end of that document, there's an excellent table that just says, by like business function, if you're in the executive, do these things. If you're in management, do these things. If you're in technology, do these things. If you're in community engagement or communications, do these things. And fairly consistently throughout, there's a column that just said, get this kind of training, or build a team that, build up skills in this way. So there's lots of really practical advice in that document that sort of says, if you've got this kind of job role, get educated about this. And also you're responsible to set the strategy, build the culture, as you say. If you're sitting at that board level, build the culture around this. If you're in management, set the right structures in place, get the right governance in place. If you're, go and engage a specialist like yourselves to help with that implementation journey, so it goes from just a concept to something real. So I've strong recommend on that document. I think it's some more than lots of others that say, I'll do this. It's like gives you some sort of little bit of a roadmap of the sorts of things that can be done. And yes, we're all itching to get our hands on Ethē. So as and when appropriate.
Yeah, we're setting up the payment gateway today. I can see my lead engineer over in the corner just working on that at the moment.
Well, that's really good news. And so I look forward to being able to use that myself. Certainly, I think it'll be interesting to potentially revisit this three-way conversation in another, man, I don't even think I could say 6 months because so much will probably have changed. So,
Absolutely.
but
We might have to reconvene at TIFF.
yeah, yes,
We might have to drag a few other people into the conversation.
I
Yeah.
believe so. Well, they do say that once you've been to the Tropical Innovation Festival once, you never leave. So,
It took me about 2 months to mentally come back, that's for
yeah,
sure. I'm really interested to know where Sean's going to be in his caravan next time we have a call.
yeah, yes.
Me too. No
so
plans. So wherever we are.
This the beauty of, presumably there's a Starlink, sitting on top of the van or something. Is that right? But
Not yet. I'm surviving with my hotspotting from my phone still at the moment. But I've got to say, we will have to go back to home base pretty soon and get back into the office and crunch away. I'm missing my surround screens to do all my stuff on.
Yep.
But this is the new modernity, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, thank you very much for dialing in from being on the go. Thanks also to you, James, for making time in the midst of building the plane as we fly it. We'll look forward to catching up with you.
Fantastic.
Again soon.
Pleasure, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks very
Mark.
much.
Right.
Thanks, James.
No worries.